The door burst open so violently I thought it was a SWAT raid. But no, it wasn't the police, it was two guys in khakis and polo shirts waving a gun around and yelling about HOA violations. Let me repeat that, HOA violations. I didn't know whether to laugh or duck for cover. One second, I was flipping burgers with my Navy SEAL brothers Jake and Luke. The next, I'm staring down the barrel of a Glock held by a guy who looked like he moonlights as a mall cop. Step aside, the gunman barked, his voice shaking just enough to give away how much he didn't want to be here. His partner, Clipboard Guy, stood behind him, clutching a clipboard like it was some kind of magical shield. "We're with the HOA Enforcement Committee," he added, as if that explained why they were breaking into my house like I'd stolen their lawn gnome. "Now, let me ask you this. If two fake HOA cops barged into your home with guns drawn, what would you do? Would you let them in? Would you call their bluff? Or would you do what I did, stall for time while silently praying your ex-Navy SEAL brothers were paying attention? Drop your answer in the comments below. I'm dying to know how you'd handle this kind of suburban insanity. Anyway, back to the story. These guys weren't just here to hand out fines for unapproved mailbox designs or Christmas lights that stayed up too long. No, these clowns were here to intimidate me into submission, and they picked the wrong house for that. "Unauthorized modifications," Clipboard Guy said, his voice dripping with fake authority. "We've received multiple complaints about your property." "Complaints?" I asked, crossing my arms and leaning against the doorframe. "Like what?" "That's classified," he snapped. "Classified? Really? This wasn't Area 51, it was my backyard barbecue." But before I could respond, gunman stepped forward and jabbed his weapon in my direction. "We don't need to explain ourselves," he growled. "Step aside." Now, I've dealt with my fair share of HOA nonsense over the years: bogus fines, passive-aggressive letters about my lawn being 0.3 inches too tall, but this was a new low. And while I may not be a lawyer, even I know you can't just barge into someone's house without a warrant. So I stood my ground. "Do you have a warrant?" I asked calmly. Gunman's grip on his weapon tightened. Clipboard Guy shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly realizing this wasn't going as planned. "We don't need a warrant," Gunman said through gritted teeth. "Actually," came a voice from behind me, "you do." Jake stepped into view like some kind of tactical ghost, silent, calm, and absolutely terrifying if you didn't know him. He's built like a tank and has this way of looking at people that makes them question all their life choices up to that point. Clipboard Guy actually took a step back when he saw him. "This doesn't concern you," Gunman snapped. Jake raised an eyebrow and folded his arms across his chest. "You sure about that?" Before Gunman could answer or make another dumb decision, Luke appeared behind Jake holding, wait for it, a spatula. Because if there's one thing Luke believes in, it's being prepared for anything, even if that means flipping burgers mid-crisis. "What's going on?" Luke asked casually, twirling the spatula like it was some kind of weaponized baton. "These gentlemen are with the HOA," I said dryly. "Apparently they think they can come into my house without a warrant." Luke tilted his head and studied them for a moment before saying, "HOA? Huh. Funny, didn't know HOA stood for highly overcompensating amateurs." I swear I saw Clipboard Guy's eye twitch. Gunman growled something under his breath and took another step forward, but before he could do anything else stupid, Jake moved. One second he was standing next to me, the next he had disarmed Gunman so fast it was like watching an action movie in real life. Luke moved just as quickly, grabbing Clipboard Guy by the arm and twisting it behind his back with one hand while still holding his spatula in the other. "You know," Luke said conversationally as he restrained him, "I've always wondered what kind of person wakes up one day and decides to pretend to be an HOA enforcer. Is there some kind of training program for this? Do they give out badges at Home Depot?" By this point, all I could do was stand there trying not to laugh as these two idiots realized they had made a huge mistake breaking into my house. Within seconds, both men were sitting on my porch tied up with zip ties Luke had pulled out of his pocket because apparently he carries those everywhere. Jake had confiscated their IDs, which turned out to be fake, and their car keys. As we stood there catching our breath, Jake looked at me and said with a grin, "So, still think you don't need our help?" And that's how what started as an ordinary Friday evening turned into one of the craziest nights of my life, all because two wannabe tough guys thought they could intimidate me in my own home over HOA violations. "So," he said, crouching down in front of Clipboard Guy, "what's the deal here? You guys just wake up this morning and think, you know what sounds fun? Let's go impersonate law enforcement and harass a homeowner over some imaginary HOA violations. Or is this more of a full-time gig for you?" Clipboard Guy glared at him but didn't say a word. Jake just smiled. "Oh, the strong silent type," he said. "I love those. They always crack first." Meanwhile, Luke was pacing back and forth, still holding his spatula like it was a weapon of mass destruction. "You know what I don't get?" he said, waving the spatula for emphasis. "Why the gun? I mean, if you're gonna fake being HOA enforcers, at least commit to the role. Show up with a clipboard and a passive-aggressive letter about lawn care violations. Maybe throw in a pamphlet about acceptable mailbox designs. But a gun? That's just sloppy." At this point, I couldn't help but laugh. Because honestly, Luke had a point. If these guys were trying to intimidate me into compliance, they'd clearly skip the chapter in the HOA handbook about how to do it properly. But then Clipboard Guy finally broke his silence. "You don't understand," he muttered. Jake leaned in closer. "Oh, I think we understand just fine," he said. "You're a couple of low-level thugs working for someone higher up the food chain. Someone who thought they could scare my brother into submission because they didn't count on him having backup." Clipboard Guy shook his head. "It's not like that," he said. "We were just following orders." "Following orders?" Luke repeated, stopping mid-pace. "What are you, stormtroopers? You're not even good at it." That's when Sunglasses McTrigger-Happy decided to chime in. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said through gritted teeth. Jake raised an eyebrow and looked at me. "Did he really just say that?" he asked. I nodded. "He did." Jake turned back to Sunglasses and smiled that calm, terrifying smile of his. "Buddy," he said, "you have no idea who you're messing with. Now, let me pause here for a second to give you some context about why these guys were here in the first place. See, my house is technically exempt from HOA rules because it was built before the neighborhood association was formed. But that hasn't stopped them from trying to drag me into their little fiefdom every chance they get. It started small, letters about my grass being too tall or my trash cans being visible from the street. Then they escalated to fines for things like having an unapproved fence or parking my truck in my own driveway overnight. Apparently that's a crime in HOA land. And when I ignored all of that, they started sending people to my house to take pictures and leave warning notices taped to my door. But this was a whole new level of crazy. "So who sent you?" Jake asked Clipboard Guy. He hesitated for a moment before finally saying Henshaw. Now that name caught my attention. Mr. Henshaw was the president of our HOA, a self-important blowhard who seemed to think running a neighborhood association made him some kind of dictator. He'd been gunning for me ever since I moved in because he couldn't stand the fact that my house wasn't under his control. "Henshaw sent you?" I repeated. Clipboard Guy nodded reluctantly. Luke let out a low whistle. "Wow," he said. "I knew HOAs were bad, but hiring goons with guns? That's next level petty." Jake stood up and crossed his arms over his chest. "All right," he said. "Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna tell us everything Henshaw told you to do, and if you leave anything out, I promise you'll regret it." Clipboard Guy looked like he wanted to argue but thought better of it when Jake gave him the look. "You know the one, it's that look Navy SEALs give you right before they make you wish you'd stayed home that day." So Clipboard Guy spilled everything. How Henshaw had hired them to intimidate me into signing some bogus agreement putting my house under HOA jurisdiction. How they'd been watching my property for weeks. How they'd even broken into my backyard once or twice to take pictures as evidence. By the time he finished talking, I was so angry I could barely see straight. "You broke into my backyard?" I asked. Clipboard Guy nodded sheepishly. "Well," Luke said, twirling his spatula again, "that explains why your security cameras kept picking up movement at night." Jake turned to me and raised an eyebrow. "You didn't tell me about that." "I thought it was raccoons," I said defensively. Luke snorted. "Raccoons with clipboards? Hey," I shot back. "It's Texas. You never know." But as much as we were joking around, there was nothing funny about what these guys had done, or what Henshaw had tried to pull. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was criminal behavior. "So what do we do now?" Luke asked. Jake grinned and cracked his knuckles. "Oh," he said, "I've got a few ideas." And just like that, our quiet Friday night barbecue turned into something else entirely. Operation Takedown Henshaw. After Clipboard Guy spilled the beans about Henshaw being the mastermind behind this whole ridiculous operation, it was clear we weren't just dealing with a couple of wannabe tough guys. No, this was a full-blown HOA power trip orchestrated by a man who clearly thought he was some kind of suburban kingpin. And let me tell you, if there's one thing my brothers and I can't stand, it's someone abusing their authority. Jake, being Jake, immediately started planning our next move. "All right," he said, pacing back and forth on my porch like he was back in a Navy briefing room. "First things first, We need to secure the perimeter. Secure the perimeter? I repeated. Jake, this is my house, not a war zone. Tell that to these clowns. He shot back, gesturing at the two tied-up goons who were now looking more nervous by the second. For all we know, Henshaw's got more of these idiots on standby. Luke nodded. He's right. We need to be ready for anything. Now, I'll admit, part of me thought they were overreacting. But then again, these were the same guys who once turned a broken-down car into a makeshift tank during a training exercise just because they could. So I figured it was probably best to let them do their thing. While Jake and Luke started setting up what can only be described as a suburban defense strategy, complete with motion sensors and an improvised alarm system made out of beer cans, I went inside to grab my laptop. If we were going to take down Henshaw, I needed to gather some evidence. See, over the years, I'd kept a record of every ridiculous fine, warning notice, and passive-aggressive letter the HOA had sent me. I even had copies of the bylaws proving that my house wasn't subject to their rules. But what I didn't have was proof that Henshaw had been targeting me specifically, or that he'd hired goons to intimidate me into compliance. That's where Jake came in. "Let me see your security footage," he said as soon as I walked back outside. I handed him my laptop and pulled up the recordings from my backyard cameras. Sure enough, there they were. Clipboard guy and sunglasses sneaking around my property in the middle of the night like a couple of raccoons in khakis. "Well," Jake said with a grin, "this is gonna make for some great evidence." Luke leaned over his shoulder to get a better look. "Wait, pause it right there," he said, pointing at the screen. Is that guy holding a measuring tape?" I squinted at the footage and sure enough, Clipboard guy was standing in my backyard with a tape measure in one hand and his clipboard in the other. "What the hell is he doing?" I asked. "Probably measuring your grass," Luke said with a laugh. "Gotta make sure it's within regulation height." I rolled my eyes. Unbelievable. But as ridiculous as it was, this footage was exactly what we needed to prove that Henshaw had crossed the line from annoying HOA president to full-blown criminal mastermind. And once we had enough evidence compiled, including screenshots of fake fines and emails from Henshaw himself, we decided it was time to confront him directly. Now, most people would probably handle this kind of situation by calling the police or hiring a lawyer. But my brothers, they had other ideas. "We're going straight to his house," Jake announced. "Straight to his house?" I repeated. "Are you insane?" "Probably," Luke said with a shrug. "But hey, it worked for us in Fallujah." "This isn't Fallujah," I snapped. "No," Jake agreed. "It's worse, it's suburbia." And with that, we loaded up into Luke's truck and headed for Henshaw's place. Now, let me paint you a picture of Henshaw's house. It's one of those oversized McMansions with perfectly manicured lawns and way too many decorative fountains. The kind of place that screams, "I'm compensating for something." And as we pulled into his driveway, it became immediately clear that he wasn't expecting visitors. Especially not three very angry men armed with evidence and an overwhelming sense of justice. Jake knocked on the door while Luke and I stood behind him like backup dancers in an action movie. A few moments later, Henshaw opened the door wearing what can only be described as the world's ugliest bathrobe. "Can I help you?" he asked, looking us up and down like we were Girl Scouts selling cookies. "Oh yeah," Jake said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You can help us by explaining why you sent two armed goons to my brother's house." Henshaw blinked at him like he'd just been slapped in the face with a wet fish. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered. "Really?" Jake said, pulling out his phone and playing the security footage for him. "Because this sure looks like your guys sneaking around his property." Henshaw's face turned about 3 shades paler as he watched the video. I can explain," he said weakly. "Oh, please do," Luke said cheerfully. "We love a good story." Henshaw hesitated for a moment before finally breaking down and admitting everything. How he'd been trying to force me into signing an agreement putting my house under HOA control. How he'd hired Clipboard guy and sunglasses through some shady security company. How he thought intimidating me would be easier than dealing with me through legal channels. By the time he finished talking, I was so angry I could barely see straight. But Jake stayed calm as ever. "Well," he said slowly, "you've got 2 options here. You can resign as HOA president effective immediately and leave my brother alone. Or we can take all this evidence to the police and let them handle it. Henshaw didn't even hesitate. I'll resign, he said quickly. And, Jake prompted. And leave your brother alone, Henshaw added meekly. Good choice, Luke said with a grin. And just like that, it was over, or so we thought. But little did we know. Well, let's save that for later. You'd think that after Henshaw folded like a cheap lawn chair and agreed to resign, the drama would be over, right? Wrong. Because apparently, in the world of HOA dictatorships, there's always a backup plan. And Henshaw's backup plan showed up about 20 minutes later in the form of a black SUV rolling into my driveway like it was auditioning for a Fast and Furious sequel. I was inside with Jake and Luke, going over the evidence we'd collected and trying to figure out what to do next when Luke's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen and frowned. Guys, he said, standing up and heading toward the window. We've got company. Jake followed him to the window, and I swear I've never seen him look so serious. Not even during that time he accidentally set off a smoke grenade in my garage. Black SUV, he said quietly. Tinted windows. No plates. Let me guess, I said, joining them at the window. Henshaw's reinforcements? Jake nodded. Looks like it. Luke grinned and cracked his knuckles. Well, this just got interesting. Now, let me pause here for a second to explain something about my brothers. They're not the kind of guys who panic under pressure or who back down from a fight. No, they're the kind of guys who see a black SUV full of armed goons pulling into their brother's driveway and immediately start strategizing like it's game night. All right, Jake said, turning away from the window. Mark, lock the doors and stay inside. Luke and I will handle this. Handle this, I repeated. Jake, these guys have guns. So do we, Luke said cheerfully. You brought guns to my house? I asked. Luke shrugged. We're Navy SEALs. It's kind of our thing. Before I could argue, they were already moving into action. Jake grabbed his duffel bag from the living room and pulled out what looked like half an armory, handguns, tactical knives, zip ties, you name it. Luke grabbed his spatula because apparently he wasn't ready to part with it just yet and followed Jake out the back door. Meanwhile, I stayed inside like they told me to, mostly because I didn't want to get shot, and watched through the window as they approached the SUV with all the confidence of two guys who've been through way worse than HOA henchmen. The SUV doors opened slowly and 4 men stepped out, each one dressed in tactical gear that looked like it had been ordered off Wish.com. They were armed with pistols and had that same fake tough guy vibe as clipboard guy and sunglasses McTrigger happy. Jake didn't even flinch as he walked right up to them with Luke by his side. Evening, he said casually. Can we help you? One of the men, let's call him Tactical Vest Guy, stepped forward and sneered at them. We're here for Mark Thompson, he said. Jake raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what do you want with him? That's none of your business, Tactical Vest Guy snapped. Jake smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and said, actually, it is my business. The tension was so thick you could have cut it with one of Luke's tactical knives or his spatula for that matter, and for a moment no one moved. Then Tactical Vest Guy made his first mistake. He reached for his gun. Big mistake. Before he could even draw it, Jake disarmed him faster than I could blink and had him pinned to the ground while Luke took out another guy with what can only be described as spatula foo. A move so ridiculous yet effective that I almost felt bad for laughing while watching it unfold. The other 2 men hesitated for just a second too long enough for Jake and Luke to take them down without breaking a sweat. By the time it was over, which took all of about 30 seconds, the 4 men were tied up on my front lawn looking more confused than angry. Jake crouched down in front of Tactical Vest Guy and said calmly, all right, let's try this again. What do you want with Mark Thompson? Tactical Vest Guy glared at him but didn't say a word, so Luke stepped in with his usual flair for theatrics. Listen, he said cheerfully, twirling his spatula like it was some kind of magic wand. You can either tell us what we want to know, or we can spend the next hour teaching you why messing with Navy SEALs is a really bad idea. Tactical Vest Guy looked at him like he wasn't sure whether to laugh or cry, but eventually decided crying was probably safer. Henshaw sent us, he muttered reluctantly. Jake nodded like he'd expected as much. And what were your orders? To scare Mark into signing the agreement, Tactical Vest Guy admitted. Luke snorted. Scare him? Buddy, if you wanted scary, you should have stayed home. Jake stood up and crossed his arms over his chest. All right, he said slowly. Here's what's gonna happen. You're gonna call Henshaw and tell him this little operation is over, and if we ever see any of you near this house again, we'll make sure you regret it. Tactical vest guy nodded quickly, probably because he knew Jake wasn't bluffing, and pulled out his phone to make the call while still tied up on my lawn. As soon as Henshaw answered, Tactical Vest Guy stammered out something about how their mission had failed and how they weren't coming back, which seemed to satisfy Jake enough to let them go after confiscating their weapons and IDs for good measure. By the time they drove off in their beat-up SUV, which now had a few dents courtesy of Luke's spatula, I couldn't help but feel both relieved and impressed by how my brothers had handled everything without even breaking a sweat. Well, Jake said as he walked back inside with Luke by his side. That was fun. Fun. I repeated incredulously. You call that fun? Luke grinned and patted me on the shoulder. Come on, it's not every day you get to take down HOA henchmen with a spatula. And honestly, he had a point. Alright, so after Tactical Vest Guy and his merry band of HOA henchmen sped off in their dented SUV, I thought briefly that the chaos was finally over. I mean, how much more could Henshaw possibly throw at us? But as it turns out, the man wasn't just petty, he was persistent. And that's when I realized, if we wanted to put an end to this once and for all, we weren't just going to play defense. Oh no, we were going on the offensive. The next morning, Jake, Luke, and I sat down at my kitchen table with coffee, a legal pad, and a plan. Well, Jake had a plan. Luke mostly had snacks. Alright, Jake said, tapping his pen against the table like he was about to brief us on a military op. Step 1. We take all the evidence we've collected, security footage, emails, fake fines, and file a police report. Step 2, he continued, we go public. Post everything online. Let the whole neighborhood know what Henshaw's been up to. And step 3? I asked. Jake grinned. Step 3 is my favorite. We make sure Henshaw never pulls this kind of stunt again. Now, before you start thinking we were about to do something illegal or unethical, don't worry. Jake's plan was perfectly above board. But it was also designed to hit Henshaw where it hurt the most, his reputation. First things first, we headed down to the local police station to file a report. And let me tell you, explaining this situation to the officer at the front desk was an experience in itself. So let me get this straight, the officer said, looking up from his notepad with an expression that screamed, I don't get paid enough for this. Your HOA president hired armed men to intimidate you into signing some kind of agreement? Exactly, I said. And your brothers here, he gestured at Jake and Luke, disarmed them and tied them up on your lawn? Yup, Jake said with a grin. The officer blinked at us for a moment before shaking his head and muttering something about how he really needed a vacation. But in the end, he took our statement and promised to look into it, which was good enough for me. Next up, step 2. We spent the rest of the afternoon compiling everything we had on Henshaw into one glorious expose. Emails demanding compliance with HOA rules that didn't apply to me? Check. Security footage of clipboard guy in sunglasses sneaking around my backyard? Check. Screenshots of fake fines and bogus violation notices? Double check. And then we posted it all online on Facebook, Nextdoor, even the HOA's own community forum, because yes, they had one. Within hours, the comments started rolling in. This explains so much, one neighbor wrote. Henshaw fined me $500 last year for having an unapproved bird feeder. Another chimed in, he tried to make me replace my mailbox because it wasn't aesthetically pleasing. Who does that? But my personal favorite came from someone who simply wrote, Henshaw is a clown. Short, sweet, and 100% accurate. By the end of the day, word had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who'd been too afraid to speak up before were finally coming forward with their own stories of harassment and intimidation by Henshaw and his cronies. It was like watching a dam break, and honestly, it was beautiful. But here's where things got really interesting. The next morning, I got a call from one of Jake's old Navy buddies, a guy named Mike who now worked as a private investigator. Apparently, Jake had sent him some of our evidence just to see if there was anything else we could dig up on Henshaw. And boy, did Mike deliver. Turns out your HOA president has quite the history, Mike said over the phone. He's been involved in multiple lawsuits over the years, most of them related to fraud or misuse of HOA funds. Misuse of funds? I repeated. Oh yeah, Mike said. We're talking thousands of dollars unaccounted for, money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood improvements but mysteriously disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but at the same time it made perfect sense. Of course, Henshaw wasn't just some overzealous HOA president, he was a full-blown scam artist who'd been using his position to line his own pockets. Armed with this new information, Jake and I decided it was time for step 3, making sure Henshaw never pulled this kind of stunt again. We took everything Mike had uncovered along with our original evidence and handed it over to both the police and a lawyer specializing in HOA law. Yes, that's apparently a thing. And within days, Henshaw found himself facing not only criminal charges but also a civil lawsuit filed by several members of our neighborhood. The fallout was swift and satisfying. Henshaw resigned as HOA president in disgrace, and by resigned, I mean he was basically forced out by an angry mob of neighbors who showed up at his house demanding answers and probably their money back. The HOA board held an emergency meeting to appoint a new president. Someone who actually seemed interested in improving the neighborhood instead of terrorizing it. And they even voted to revise their bylaws to prevent anything like this from happening again. As for me, well, let's just say life has been a lot quieter since Henshaw's departure. No more bogus fines or late-night visits from fake enforcers. No more passive-aggressive letters about my grass being too tall or my truck being parked in my own driveway overnight. Just peace and quiet, the way suburban life is supposed to be. And honestly, I couldn't have done it without Jake and Luke. Sure, they may have turned my house into a makeshift war zone for 48 hours, but they also reminded me that sometimes you have to fight back against bullies like Henshaw. And if you're lucky enough to have Navy SEALs in your corner while you do it, even better. So there you have it. How my quiet suburban life turned into an action-packed revenge story, and how we took down one of the pettiest HOA presidents in history without breaking a single law. If you enjoyed this story, or if you've ever dealt with an HOA nightmare of your own, make sure to like this video, share it with your friends, and drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And hey, maybe your story will inspire our next adventure. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales of suburban chaos and Navy SEAL shenanigans. Thanks for watching.